Welcome back to My Trauma's Chronic, but I'm Iconic. Today we have an incredibly insightful episode lined up for you. We're honoured to be joined by a distinguished expert in the fields of psychology, diversity, and equity. She's a consultant psychologist and a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion expert, with a wealth of experience in clinical negligence, forensics, and educational advocacy. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Shungu H. Today, we'll be delving into the multifaceted world of expert witnessing in clinical negligence, forensic, and SEN, while also shining a spotlight on the critical mission of removing barriers to learning and combating discrimination and racism in educational settings. Before we dive in, let's take a moment to introduce Dr. Shungu H. She is a highly respected consultant psychologist and a DEI expert, renowned for her groundbreaking work in the fields of educational psychology and educational equity, with a passion for promoting inclusivity and dismantling systematic barriers. She has dedicated her career to advocating for marginalized communities and ensuring access to quality care and education for all. Throughout her career, she has served as an expert witness in numerous high-profile cases of clinical negligence and forensics, providing invaluable psychological insights and testimony to aid in legal proceedings. Her expertise in assessing psychological factors and advocating for justice has earned her widespread recognition and respect within the legal community. In addition to her work as an expert witness, she is a passionate advocate for educational equity and inclusivity. She has worked tirelessly to remove barriers to learning and to address issues of discrimination and racism within educational and corporate institutes. Today, we'll have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Magu Gazada firsthand as she shares her experiences, insights, and strategies promoting equity and inclusion in both clinical, educational settings, and corporate organization. So, without further ado, let's welcome her. Can you share with our listeners a bit about your background and what led you to pursue a career in psychology and diversity, equity, and inclusion advocacy?
Yeah, so it's a long story, but I'll try and keep it short. I always had a kind of a passion for working with people, and when I was at university, I started a problem page called Dear Hilda, which is my middle name. And one of the union rep, people sort of said to me, "Gosh, you're really good at this." The problem page was doing really well. And he basically said to me, "Have you thought about becoming a psychologist?" And at that point, I was kind of toying with the idea, but I hadn't really decided on what I wanted to do. And he basically said to me, "Look, I've got a friend who's an education psychologist who works in Hackney. Why don't you go and spend some time with them and see what you think?" So that's what I did. I went and spent a day with this amazing psychologist called Veronica Finch. And I kind of saw the work she was doing and really found myself thinking, yeah, no, I could do this. And, I could really kind of find, it aligned with my purpose and what I wanted to do. So, so I then kind of looked at what training was required and proceeded to pursue this career.
As a consultant psychologist and DI expert, you have extensive experience in clinical negligence cases. Can you walk us through your role as an expert witness in such cases and the impact your testimony can have on legal proceedings?
Yeah, the role is very, can be very complex, right? So you're working with a team of legal professionals, but you're also working with other expert witnesses. So often the approach is from solicitors, who come to me really kind of seeking that psychological expertise. And my role is very much about trying to support everyone who's involved in better understanding the needs of the child or the young person. And in really kind of exploring, areas like their cognitive functioning, thinking about what barriers currently exist in terms of supporting them to fulfill their outcomes. So, usually, in terms of kind of, getting that picture of the child's holistic needs involves, meeting with the parents or the carers so that you've got that background. Also, meeting with a young person and doing an observation, whether it be in school or whether it be at home, and then carrying out some form of, testing or assessments. And it's very much a case of gathering lots of data, right, and triangulating the information you get to form that picture of what the child's needs are, and then to offer recommendations about how those needs can best be met within a school setting, or if they're going to be educated at home, then it's thinking about what that would look like.
Transitioning to your work as an expert witness in forensics, what are some key differences between providing testimonies in negligence cases versus forensic cases?
Yeah, so I mean, clinical negligence is all around kind of looking at the injury which is taking place, usually when the mother is having the baby, and often something goes wrong during, sometimes during that time. There can be other clinical negligence cases as well, but that's usually the bulk of the cases I'm dealing with. So clinical negligent cases are about trying to understand the kind of the the what would have the child's outcomes been had the injury not occurred, right? So but for the injury, what would this child have gone on to do? What could they have achieved, and so forth. Whereas with kind of forensic cases, it's much more about looking at, we really kind of, come across the young people, as and adults really, but a lot of them have had some form of learning difficulty or learning disability, which impacts their decision making and their ability to understand some of their actions and what they're doing. So, through the kind of the lenses of forensic psychology, it's very much about looking at, the young person or the adult. A lot of the cases I deal with are adults who've committed some kind of, who've basically come, foul of the law. They've, committed some kind of crime, and the question is, what are their needs, i.e., learning needs, and trying to get a sense of mental capacity. Did they understand, have they got the mental capacity to actually understand their actions and what they're doing? And also really getting a sense of, in that moment when they made the decision to act in this way, you know, did they really understand the consequences of their behaviors, and trying to unpick that. So it's about assessing the adult, as it were, and getting a sense of, to what extent their learning needs or learning disabilities have impacted on the crime they've committed.
Like, how do you maintain objectivity and impartiality when providing expert testimonies in legal proceedings, particularly in emotionally charged or contentious cases?
Yeah, no, it's so important to do that really. And one of the things I know as psychologists we always say is that we're independent, right? Even though, I think when we come to talk about local authorities, I'll point out sometimes my concerns that, psychologists are not always independent. But I think, generally, as psychologists know, especially psychologists conducting expert witness work, we really have to maintain that independence. And the way of, the way I find of doing that, best really, is about placing the child or the young person or the adult very much central, right? And really thinking about their holistic needs, and thinking about what's needed to support them, in fulfilling, in removing barriers, fulfilling their outcomes, in getting an understanding of why they've acted the way they have. And I think when you do that, when you kind of step aside, place the client at the center, you're then able to offer that impartial advice, because what you're doing is you're not allowing the noise of funding, or lack of budgets or money, or you're not allowing the noise of kind of is it right that they behaved in this way, right, in terms of any kind of crimes, right? You're looking very much at the person and really trying to understand why they've behaved in the way that they've behaved.
Mhm. Shifting gears to your advocacy work in education, what motivated you to focus on removing barriers to learning and promoting inclusivity in educational settings?
Sorry, I lost you a little bit there. Just say you're going to have to repeat that question for me.
It's okay. I'm going to shift gears a little bit to your advocacy work and
Yeah.
education. What motivated you to focus on removing barriers to learning and promoting inclusivity in educational settings?
Yeah, I mean, I think, all of my work, as I say, usually is that all of my work is about the key theme is about removing barriers. It's about trying to work out what has gone wrong for this individual. Why are they in the place they're at? And what do we as systems and organizations and as individuals need to do to ensure that we support them to have better outcomes. And I think really kind of what motivated me and what motivates me is about, yeah, I suppose, you know primarily it's probably my own experiences, right? So I
Mhm.
came to the UK when I was 8 years old. I came originally from Zimbabwe, and I remember arriving and being placed in a remedial class, because I didn't speak English, and I remember kind of the challenges I faced, going from where I was high achieving and top of the class, in Zimbabwe, and doing, and I remember my test results and doing really well and everything else, and then coming and being placed in this remedial class. And I think the failure of the adults around me to realize that actually there was a language barrier, but that actually I didn't have learning difficulties, was a real problem for me. And I feel that that failure kind of set me back, and it took a long time before the teachers around me then kind of I thought realized, well, actually, it is a second language factor, and we need to kind of be placing her in more challenging lessons and everything else. And I kind of feel that that key barrier for me was no, it was a real problem. And I suppose when you look at at the surface and you don't explore deeper and take time to relate and understand the person in front of you, and I often talk about empathy and compassion, right? When we just look at the surface and don't take that time, we miss getting that holistic understanding of the individual, of the child, of the person. And when we miss those signs and that understanding, what happens is that we make errors. My view is that we make errors in judgment, whether that be as teachers or whether that be as parents and carers. But we can make errors in judgment by not fully understanding the child or young person in front of us. And I think, similarly, judges, when I'm thinking about forensic work, judges can make errors of judgment if they're not fully understanding what's brought the young person to the point at which they are, and what's happened and what their experiences are.
Can you share some examples of successful initiatives or interventions you've been involved with that has made a tangible impact in promoting equity and inclusivity in education?
Yeah, I mean that's really kind of what I spend my time doing. So in May 2022, I wrote a book called Understanding and Dealing with Everyday Racism: The Six Stages Framework. And whilst the book focuses on the foundation, it looks at racism as the core. It also it helps us to understand the experiences of other marginalized groups. So, you can apply the six stages framework to other areas, such as understanding and dealing with, issues around disability, or, kind of the needs of divergent individuals, and so forth. Um, And so within the within my book, the stages framework, there are a number of toolkits which I use to really kind of support, some of that work which needs to be done within organizations. Um, and one toolkit is, it's very much about kind of supporting the development of language. So there's a toolkit called the prejudice racism spectrum, right? And again, that has been adapted to look at other areas, but it essentially looks at the language and the behaviors of racism and what that looks like on a continuum, so that you're looking at kind of, from low key racism, even though, I think I often say that there's no such thing as low key racism, right? Racism is racism. But what this prejudice racism spectrum does is that it breaks down the behaviors and what you might see in terms of, the manifestation of racism. And so, it kind of indicates, some of the indicators are things like, microaggressions, right? Gaslighting, really kind of looking at when that racism begins and then looking at the kind of extreme. And by using tools like that, it gives people the language to describe their experiences, because part of the challenges we have in terms of equity and inclusion, in terms of, dealing with discriminations, is that people, they are often, the conversations can be quite charged. People don't have the language to talk about their experiences, and often you find that the door closes very quickly, because the minute you raise an issue and kind of say, actually, I felt your behavior was inappropriate, or I feel that what you said was not right, immediately the door shuts and people say, well, actually, are you calling me a racist? Are you this? And you're then not able to explore those behaviors, or to discuss them. So the prejudice racism spectrum is a tool for really kind of maintaining, you know, and allowing that door to remain open, so that some teaching and some support can go in place, and so that you can have that conversation about what was problematic about the behavior or the language that was used, and why does it amount to, whether it be racism or sexism, or whatever. And we've got a perfect example in the media right now, haven't we, with Lee Anderson, who's the MP, who has recently made an Islamophobic comment, right? And there've been questions about, well, actually, is it Islamophobic? Is it this? And that kind of that reluctance on the part of some people to actually label those behaviors as Islamophobic, right? And I think that what the prejudice racism spectrum does is that it supports us in having those conversations, but by breaking them down. So you break down the conversations so that you understand what languages and what behavior is racist, and you also then help the people who are using that discriminatory language to understand why that behavior is wrong.
Mm. Do you, looking like ahead, what do you see as the most pressing challenges and opportunities in the field of psychology, diversity, and education? And how do you envision addressing them in your work moving forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My doctorate was in the area of emotional intelligence, and I did my doctorate about 12 years ago. And I was looking at the role of educational psychologists in supporting teachers and schools in meeting the needs of children and young people with emotional difficulties and mental health issues. And I remember, I was on, when I was, abroad, this was about 8 years ago. I remember sitting there and having a conversation with two American women, and actually talking about what I saw as the rising numbers of young people with mental health issues within our system. And I remember at that time kind of talking about how I felt that I needed to do more work within that area. But unfortunately, I was unwell. Life took over. I was unwell for a period of time, and I look back now, and I look back when I look at where we are in terms of what's happening around mental health and the rises in terms of mental health issues. I really kind of get a sense of how you could see some of those problems coming, and I sort of feel that we didn't prepare adequately enough to address the issues around mental health. So, for example, I think there was a news item recently which talked about the large numbers of young people who are aged between 18 and 24, and how there's more of a prevalence of mental health issues within those groups, and really just kind of the fact that a lot of these young people are not able to either attend college, or they're not able to sustain work. So, that's one element, that's one big challenge, as I say it, right? That advent of the increasing numbers of young people and adults with mental health within society. On top of that, on top of that, there's the challenge around differences and understanding the needs of others who are different to us, and seeing them with compassion and with empathy, and seeing them as human beings, right? So I think, so I suppose for me, there is something about how do we begin to address some of those key challenges we're seeing, whether it be within schools, within the workplace, challenges around, supporting self-esteem, supporting identities, supporting mental health, but also ensuring that we have a society and a world that is tolerant of differences and can actually bridge some of those divides.
Do you think we will ever get in a place into the world where people will understand that we are different and there's nothing wrong with being different? Do you think, as as humans or as a society, we can ever get to that point?
I like to think that we can, but I think that's kind of almost like pie in the sky, response, right? I suppose for me, there's something about the work which we all need to continually do to keep racism and discrimination at bay. So I think that there's some work which we need to be doing in order to ensure that we reach that point, right? But there's always going to be a challenge. I think people find it difficult to explore the impact of differences and the impact of discrimination and so forth. So it's a challenge. It's work we all need to do. We need to be continually opening up the conversations, exploring strategies and interventions for supporting, whether you're talking within school, for supporting students to to kind of achieve that, or whether it be within the workplace in terms of challenging and combating some of the discrimination and and problems we see within the workplace.
Can you provide an overview of the prevalence and impact of discrimination and racism in educational and professional settings?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and it's one which I feel we don't fully understand, right? I think I think because there's a lack of focus on thinking about discrimination and exploring the experiences of those who are different, whether it be racially different, or whether it be whether we're talking about disability discrimination or other forms of discrimination. I think that because there's such a reluctance to explore those issues, and because schools, frankly, a lot of schools are petrified of engaging in those conversations and really kind of discussing those issues. And for me, that causes discrimination and 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 intolerance to go underground, so they're hidden from view. But in terms of the experiences of children and young people, they're living them every day, right? They're, you'll get instances of discrimination, you'll get instances of intolerance, whether it be from other young people or from teachers. But because it's never really fully explored, a lot of those young people, in my mind, continue to suffer as a result. So, I often get, parents coming to me asking for assessments, and to kind of look at why their child is not doing well, either within school, or why it is that their child has been excluded yet another time, and so forth. And one of the things I do is that when I put on my goggles and my lenses as a psychologist, I really kind of try and use my experiences as an expert witness to not only fulfill the education psychology assessment part, but to also look at some of those challenges that are facing the young person within the system. So, within the 6 stages framework, one of the toolkits I use is called "In What Ways Do We Discriminate?" It really kind of looks at what happens when systems fail to recognize some of the barriers, some of the cultural barriers and challenges which may be around in terms of supporting children and young people. So it really kind of looks at the part that individuals can play, wittingly or unwittingly, right? That they can play in terms of perpetuating a culture and an environment which does not support all children and young people to feel like they belong.
Have you personally experienced discrimination and racism in your educational and professional journey? And how have these experiences shaped your perspective?
Yeah, no, really, really good question. Yes, I have. I've experienced I've experienced racism in different forms, right? I think when I was younger, my experiences of racism, I probably didn't understand it in that way. I was very much in all white environments, in terms of my schooling. I remember, I went to the London Oratory in the sixth form, where I was there for 3 years. And at that time, I think there were three African Caribbean girls within the sixth form, and so you learned to adapt to the environment you were in. But during that time, as a student and within schools, I was aware that discrimination existed, right? In terms of kind of, sometimes you'd feel you're being treated differently, but you were not able to articulate what that discrimination was, right? So to a large extent, what I did during those times is that you learn to cope, you learn to adapt, and you kind of turn the other way because you just kind of think, this is the way things are, right? My experiences at schools like the Oratory were brilliant, but I think what I'm trying to say is that along the way within some of the schools I had been in, I was aware of some of that some of that being treated differently and not being given the same opportunities as my peers who were white, right?
Mm.
Um, so yeah, so I've experienced discrimination within kind of school settings, but also, as a senior leader within local authorities, you know, um, and that lack of being given opportunities to progress, but also that always being challenged in a harsher way, right? So often, if you're a black senior leader within a local authority or within an organization, you find that there's sometimes less acceptance of your role within that management structure, and that and that plays out in different ways, right? There can be a lot of undermining. So again, going back to that prejudice racism spectrum, if I was to name some of the behaviors which occurred for me as a senior leader, I experienced things like, being undermined in my position. So I would have, members of staff who felt that actually they could do the job better than me purely because of their color rather than because of their qualifications, right? So there's that kind of that undermining. I experienced microaggressions. I experienced the gaslighting which goes on in meetings with other senior leaders where your voice is not being heard. You make a comment and it's like, well, actually, well, they'll pass on to someone else, right? So they, as a senior, you learn to navigate some of this, but the racism, was there, and I think for me, the biggest challenge was about how do you call that racism out and how do you put a stop to it? So, and I did that, but in doing that, what you learn very quickly is that sometimes the minute we call racism out, it can be very difficult for you to then kind of continue a path within a certain profession. So I suppose what I find concerning within organizations is that sometimes there's a collusion between the different systems of an organization in terms of either the role of HR in terms of actually dealing with some of those issues in an effective way. So the person who is raising the issues and calling out racism is often ostracized and made to feel like they're the problem rather than the organization, and some of the behaviors within the organization are a problem.
Mm, I agree. I feel like I think when I have no problem questioning authority right there and then. For me, authority, there's a hierarchy. I respect that there's a hierarchy. If there's a problem, I can go up it and solve an issue. I feel like because of my neurodivergence, I fail to understand the consequences of me speaking out will be. And
Absolutely.
a lot of, people that I work with or my friends or people that I know will be like, Rosemary, if you say that this and this will happen. And as a person with neurodivergence, I think I fail to understand the severity of those consequences. And
Yeah, and it's really interesting. Yeah, no, sorry, go ahead.
and the impact it would have. And I wouldn't notice it until it became so obvious that it's in my face. And it should never be that way. Authority, it needs to be questioned. It needs to be thing. And there should be organizations should be comfortable with being questioned. If your employees cannot question you, how can the people that you work with question you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's really interesting you should say that because I've recently, and I'm just trying to get a copy. I've recently put a post on LinkedIn where I talk about the steps to calling out racism, and
Mm.
and the die and part of those steps I feel is about preparing for that fallout, right? And preparing for what happens when you raise some of those issues. So the steps, this is the 6 stages framework, steps for calling out racism and discrimination, right? So the first step is building confidence and urgency. So for recognizing that when you experience discrimination, or when you see discriminatory behaviors, that it is important to summon the energy and the confidence to call that out, right? And the second step is recognizing the signs and symptoms of bias and discrimination in your workplace. The third step is assessing and appreciating and preparing for the impact and any possible fallout. And the fourth step is knowing the language and scripts for what to say when you call discrimination out. And then a really important step is emotional regulation and self-care. How do you ensure that you're looking after yourself during that process? And then the next step is seeking support from others, and then debriefing and reflection, and so forth. But the last step really kind of ends with repeat, because we it's important to recognize that actually these experiences don't just occur once and then that's it. It's actually thinking about, okay, so you've managed to build the confidence, you've managed to call the discrimination out and to challenge that. You've looked at emotional regulation, you've looked at how you can seek support from others. But the minute you get to the end of that, you repeat. You have to then think about, what happens when you see discrimination again. How do you behave? So it's that cycle of, from building confidence to actually calling out discrimination when we see it. But I think you're absolutely right that a lot of us forget a number of key steps. We forget to think about what the consequences will be and preparing for that fallout, but we also forget to think about how we can take care of ourselves through emotional regulation and self-care. And we also forget to identify the allies we have within a setting. Who are you going to go to talk about this? Where can your support come from? And how do you ensure that the organization does not end up isolating you and making you the problem rather than the issues that the organization is faced with?
Mm. I feel like often this is what the issue is. It's you address it very, very calmly and quietly. And when you then decide, okay, this is not working, and then you start shouting and screaming, then you're the issue. And it's like so hard to navigate that. What are some common forms of discrimination and racism that individuals may encounter in educational and professional settings?
Wow, yeah. So again, I go back to the prejudice racism spectrum, right? Because I think a lot of the forms of racism and discrimination we encounter are very much described by the prejudice racism spectrum. So, some of it can start off, as I said before, as seeming to be quite low key, right? Whether it be kind of some kind of being really kind of comments where you're being ignored, you're being dismissed, your voice is not being heard within the organization, or where people are telling jokes, are telling so-called jokes which put you down, right? Whether it be that they're focusing on issues around gender, or they're focusing on issues around disability, but actually put downs which are related to your kind of to protected characteristics. And then those discriminations, when we look at the prejudice racism spectrum, you then look at some of the undermining which can go on, in terms of your position within the organization. So if you're a woman, some of that undermining may be to do with your gender, that actually you're within an environment or an organization where women are not valued as much as men are, right? So so you can get that undermining and some of the microaggressions which can follow as a result. But if you're, or it could be that if you're disabled, that anything you contribute is not being recognized, that there's not sufficient efforts being given to thinking about modifications and how to ensure that the environment um, is right for you. And if you're neurodivergent, that actually there hasn't been much thought given to the support you require within the workplace, whether it be kind of the modifications which need to be made, or even things like support workers, right? Because one of the things which I've been telling people about more and more recently is about the funding which is available from the Department of Work and Pensions, for example. So if you're neurodivergent and you're within the workplace, or even if you run your own business and you work from home, it is possible to apply for an access to work grant which supports you to carry out your job within either within your home or within the workplace. And that funding is available. You don't have to have a diagnosis in order to access that funding. You just have to be able to describe the impact of your condition, on your ability to work. So I feel that sometimes organizations don't provide that information to people sufficiently so that support can be put in place. So if you have a support worker, you can have someone who can help you to manage your diary, who can be like, a PA who supports you, when you're finding things difficult and so forth. But there are different ways of using that support worker. So, I kind of feel that organizations need to spend, and in addition to that, you can also, as part of that grant, get some support around coaching, or to actually support you, in terms of your neurodivergence, or whether, or disabilities or whatever. um and I just feel that sometimes there isn't sufficient um support or consideration given to how we can access some of that support, um for employees who require it within the workplace.
Mm. Can you discuss the psychological effects of the discrimination and racism on individuals and communities, particularly in terms of mental health and well-being?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the psychological effects can be devastating, right? And I think, often, if I was mapping out those experiences in terms of steps, I think, from the point at which you you find the strength to identify that things are not right within your workplace, that you're experiencing discrimination, from the point where you raise that with your employees. If the organization is not at the stage where they are able to hear that without blaming you for it, what happens is that immediately the organization goes, into what I call risk management mode, right? They look at how can we minimize, you know, the concerns which have been raised, and how can we risk manage this. And often risk management involves either silencing you as the person who's raising the issue, or isolating you in terms of your comments. And so I think, in terms of psychological effects, for a lot of people who, because I work with a lot of people who come to me, because they're experiencing discrimination within the workplace, for a lot of people, some of those psychological effects are feelings of feeling isolated, feelings of questioning their sanity, and whether what they're experiencing is actually reality or not, right? There are feelings of kind, so there's that kind of, isolation, the kind of, needing to constantly check yourself, and and make sure that you're performing even better than anyone else, because the minute you raise discrimination, your work comes under scrutiny. So that organizations who are, within the 6 stages framework, where they're not able to deal with these issues, what they often do is that they cast doubt on your ability to do your job, so it becomes about you rather than about them. So, so the psychological effects are those feelings of isolation. They are kind of, a lot of people will find it difficult, going into work. They will, a lot of people, there'll be depression, anxiety when you think about going into work, and kind of how you're going to manage that on a day-to-day basis. um and a lot of people could end up being signed off, because they just, the work environment becomes so alien and so challenging that they need to remove themselves from it, because they're not able to cope. um and I think, and that continues even after the person has left their work environment. I've got a young man who's working with me at the moment. He's just been to tribunal. He won his tribunal, but at the same time, even though that's all finished, the impact of that discrimination on him as a person, will continue to affect him, and that impact, kind of extends to mental health, and his emotional well-being. And people often talk about kind of post-traumatic stress, right? Because they experience, this young man, and those of us who've suffered discrimination and racism within the workplaces, is that it is akin to post-traumatic stress disorder, so that you end up kind of reliving that experience, and you end up, having those flashbacks, which then torment you in terms of some of those experiences.
What role does empathy play in combating discrimination and racism, and how can individuals cultivate empathy in themselves and others?
Oh, I love that question, because I'm currently actually working on my next book, which is very much going to be around that area, empathy and compassion, right? And and part of my of my, when I it's funny, I kind of woke up, it must have been about 4 days ago, where I just suddenly started thinking about empathy and compassion. What happens when empathy and compassion leave the room, right? And that is going to be the title of my book, because I really feel that there's something about how do we as individuals and human beings ensure that we have that empathy and compassion for those of for everyone, and those of the people we're engaged with, and we're having conversations with, and we're working with, or educating, or whatever. And I think often discrimination and discriminatory behaviors occur when we fail to see the other person as a human being, when we lose that empathy and cannot imagine what it's like to walk, in their shoes, right? Because that lack of empathy and that lack of understanding is very much at the core of some of the problems which we're seeing, within society, and which we're seeing globally. Because if we empathized, there's no way that some of the things we're seeing globally in terms of some of the behaviors, in some of the countries abroad, that we would necessarily be seeing those behaviors. And I think, because my doctorate was in the area of emotional intelligence, empathy is a key component of emotional intelligence, right? And it's very much about how do we support individuals to 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 be able to, to not only empathize, but also to engage in some of these conversations whilst they emotionally regulate, so that they can get their point across, but so that they can still, it doesn't have that impact on their mental health.
Can you discuss the importance of cultural competence and allyship in creating inclusive environments and challenging discriminatory attitudes and behaviors?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, cultural competence is key. I do feel that, you know, um, sometimes as professionals, and I'm talking about my profession as education psychologists, that we haven't had the training and the support we need to navigate and challenge some of these issues. So I think cultural competence, relating to assessments and understanding the assessments we're using, and when not to use them, and really kind of understanding the holistic needs of the people we're working with, and understanding the cultural needs of children and young people is so important. So so for example, sometimes, when I'm working with schools, they'll say to me, yeah, but as an education psychologist, it's not really your role to be asking questions about discrimination, or asking questions about the young person's cultural needs, and asking the questions about, when the school last had their diversity, equity, and inclusion training. That's outside of the role of the education psychologist,
Ugh.
because the educational psychologist should only be focusing on the SEND areas, i.e., the special educational needs and disability areas, and talking about cognition and learning, talking about SEMH, but you shouldn't navigate past that. So you're immediately, when you ask questions about discrimination, you're immediately seen as overstepping your role as a professional. And one of the things I often say to schools and to psychologists, my peers, is that actually that's not the case. At the end of the day, the Healthcare Professionals Council, which oversees educational psychologists, in their kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion, standards, a lot of a lot of what they reference is about the role of the professional. And this extends to not only psychologists, but physiotherapists and other people who fall within the HCPC. And within those guidelines, what they say very clearly is that each professional, has a duty to actually recognize and identify discrimination when it's taking place, right?
You
Um,
tell them. Sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
No, I just said you tell them.
Yeah, and it's so important, isn't it, that it's actually about kind of recognizing when those problems are taking place, but also that as professionals, and I'm just trying to find the document so that I can read it out to you, right? So the Healthcare Professionals Council says registrants must recognize the impact of culture, equality, and diversity on practice and practice in a non-discriminatory and inclusive manner. And then the next point is registrants have to respond appropriately to the needs of all groups and individuals in practice, right? And then registrants also have to understand equality legislation. They have to recognize the potential impact of their own values, beliefs, and personal biases. And then it goes on. It's important to understand the duty to make reasonable adjustments in practice, but also to recognize the characteristics and consequences of barriers to inclusion, including for socially isolated groups. And then the last 2 points, 5.6 and 5.7, registrants have to actively challenge these barriers, supporting the implementation of change where possible. And then 5.7, you have to be able to recognize that regard to equality, diversity, and inclusion needs, that they have to be embedded in the application of all HCP standards. So, I mean, for me, I really welcome, those standards being articulated, right? Because there's no doubt in my mind that any professional going into a school has got a duty to look at how that school is meeting the needs of children who are different. And the minute you find yourself thinking, actually, things are not as they should be, as a professional, you've got a duty to challenge that. And I'm not talking about shouting from the rooftops. I'm talking about having a conversation which explores some of that in a way which supports the school to move forward, right? And ensures that the child or young person's needs are being met. So there's a duty on individuals to do that. And if and what I often say is that the trouble with working sometimes in systems that discriminate is that the professionals become silenced in their duty to do all of these things. They become complicit, right, in the discrimination which is taking place because they're not speaking up. So it's so important, I feel that actually when we see discrimination in its very many different forms, whatever that discrimination may be, it's so important that we think of our duty as healthcare professionals council, professionals, and that we find the voice to have those conversations. And a lot of psychologists will often say to me, yes, but we don't have the confidence, we need scripts. Then get the training, get the support. And that's why I feel that toolkits like the 6 stages framework should be mandatory training for all individuals, whether it be at kind of teacher training level, or whether it be within the police force, or whether it be for educational psychologists. It's so important that professionals understand the role they have to play in understanding how discrimination manifests, and also their duty in challenging discrimination when they see it.
How do you navigate these challenging conversations about discrimination and racism in educational and professional contexts, particularly when faced with resistance or denial?
Yeah, I think part of the for me the way of navigating this some of these challenges is about educating people, right? It's about using toolkits like the 6 stages framework and having those conversations and supporting people to you know, build bridges of empathy. So, one of the toolkits within the Six Stages framework is called Building Bridges of Empathy. So there's something about, for example, on the Six Stages framework, the Six Stages framework really kind of describes where people are in terms of their understanding and ability to deal with racism and discrimination. So you start off with people who are in denial and they don't really care about the needs of others. Then you get people who are avoidant and dismissive of the issues. Then you get people who are more kind of open to learning and are beginning to understand what those issues are. And then, it progresses to stage 6 where you're able to to kind of to kind of challenge. Stage 5 is challenging perceptions, and stage 6 is working with others to combat discrimination. So the Six Stages framework describes where individuals and organizations are in their journey. So part of the in answer to your question, by using toolkits like the Six Stages framework, you're able to support people to explore where they are in their journey and their understanding of discrimination and racism. And by helping them to understand where they are, you can then support them through kind of setting goals and development plans. And when I'm working with organizations, it's very much about supporting the organization in their development. By helping them identify where they are, you then support them to move forward in a positive way. And I do feel that actually that supporting people to build bridges of empathy and to think about how they can better understand the experiences of those who are different has to be a key step in how we navigate and challenge some of these issues when we come across them.
What roles do policies and procedures play in addressing discrimination and racism, and how can they be improved to better protect individuals from discriminatory practices?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I often talk about the Six Stages framework as being like a golden thread which runs right through an organization, right? So when I'm working with organizations, I talk about how they need to see it as a golden thread. So it's a golden thread which goes from, recruitment and hiring, policies and practice, um, supervision and appraisal, and then retention and succession planning. And that when you apply the Six Stages framework to all of those different different points within an organization, you're able to keep in mind and consider what issues around kind of equality and belonging, and inclusion, what that looks like. So so for me, in terms of policies and practice, I think some of the key challenges we face with policies, especially now where we've got AI and some people are generating their policies through AI generated tools or whatever. I think sometimes what we find is that policies are really just there in a performative way, right? They're just there, but they're meaningless. Right? In the past, we used to say policies languish within cabinets and or dusty folders, and they're never opened. And in these days, it's actually policies can be there, but to what extent are you actually implementing the policies, and to what extent are you looking at diversity and equality impact statements to look at actually how that policy meets and addresses the needs of those who are different within your organization, and also the needs of the client, your client group, and your stakeholders. So again, in answer to your question, I feel that it's so important to ensure that our policies are fit for purpose and that we consider issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion within those policies, and that we explore and review those policies, but more so that we are constantly gathering evidence and data to really get a better understanding of how those policies are actually operating in practice and whether they're fit for purpose. So one of the things, for example, recently I was working with an organization where one of the things I did with them was trying to get a sense of, where do you think your organization is in terms of understanding and dealing with racism. And so I got them to do that individually. So it was like almost like, where do you think you are as an individual, right? So that's the first step. So you kind of say whether you're at stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And in that organization, 60, I think it was something like 66% of the respondents, of the people who responded, said that they thought that individually, as an individual, they thought they were probably at about a stage 3 in their understanding and ability to deal with racism and discrimination. And stage 3 is very much, is really kind of that kind of becoming open, right? You really kind of beginning to recognize issues of difference. So they were very much at the early stages of their journey. And then the next question was, okay, so where do you think your organization is in terms of understanding and dealing with racism and discrimination? And it was really interesting because when you looked at the responses, 88% thought their organization was at stage 3, right? So, and when I spoke to one of the senior leaders, she said to me, "Oh my goodness, I thought we were probably at about stage 4 or 5." And so it was like, so I then had a conversation with her about, okay, so what are you seeing, or that your employees are not seeing, or what are your employees seeing that you're not seeing as an organization? And and then and some of the work I'm doing with them currently is collecting more data to try and better understand why there's that discrepancy and that mismatch between what employees are saying about their experiences of discrimination and what they experience, and what the senior leaders are saying in terms of where they think they are, because there's a gap. And if there's a gap, we need to kind of explore that, collect data, look at the evidence so that we can better understand, and then look at kind of setting goals and targets, to kind of move things forward in a positive way.
How can individuals serve as allies to marginalized communities in the fight against discrimination and racism?
So how can individuals
Serve as allies to
okay.
marginalized communities in the fight against discrimination and racism?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, and I think allyship is a really important area, right? I think currently we're seeing this move from away from so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really kind of thinking about much more allyship. I suppose in my part, I feel that there's a place for DEI, right? And I don't see that the two are exclusive. But I think that individuals, have to stop acting as bystanders when they're witnessing discrimination. Yeah, I feel that witness, if you're witness to some of the discrimination or some of the inequity which exists within your organization, you need to be able to find ways of discussing that with others, to think about, okay, what changes can we make so that this is not an issue. And unfortunately, 8 times out of 10, I think individuals tend to think about their position. So it's almost like, if I say this, then how will that impact on me? But it's actually about, how do we support individuals to advocate and speak up and act as allies for others. And and that brings us back to that question of empathy, right? Empathy and compassion. Because if you don't really care about the other person, or if you see that other person is different and therefore you've got nothing in common with them and you don't really care and all so forth, you're less likely to want to stick your neck out and actually say anything, right? So there's something about, how do we have these conversations which support the development of empathy and compassion within the workplace, where everyone can feel like they belong, where everyone can feel like they've got a voice, and where you feel it's okay to question something if you don't agree with it, right? So, and it's only by being able to do that that you can then create psychologically safe spaces, for people to act as genuine allies.
Definitely. In in your opinion, what are the most effective long-term strategies for dismantling systematic barriers and promoting equality in educational and professional settings?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to go back to the six stages framework, because I really do feel that the toolkits within the six stages framework offer organizations those strategies for actually dismantling discrimination and within workspaces and also within schools. So I think whether it be you're starting with strategies around just being able to have those conversations where you learn more about each other and you understand different identities, and kind of you support individuals to show up as their true selves and not feel that they've got to hide parts of themselves for whatever reason, right? So I think there's strategies around kind of just beginning to open up those conversations and beginning to create those psychologically safe spaces. So another kind of toolkit within the six stages framework is all up, it's around kind of psychological safety and thinking about, what does a psychologically safe environment look like? And what does that mean? What does that mean to you as an individual within that organization? So, and then I've mentioned the prejudice racism spectrum. It's another, there's strategies aligned to that, which I cover within my book. So I think there are lots of strategies, from kind of opening up conversations to actually being able to challenge discrimination when we come across it, and being able um, to ensure that policies are not just, are not just kind of languishing there, but they're actually being implemented, and they're making a real difference.
And we're going to, move on to education in particular, um, SEN. Can you tell us about your role as an expert witness in cases related to special educational needs and disabilities?
Yeah, so that's really kind of where I'm called in, again, it's either referrals coming from solicitors or from parents, right?
Mm.
So where there's kind of the parent, for example, I've got a parent recently whose child has just been excluded from an independent school, and she's basically challenging the school, but also challenging the local authority to offer a school which meets her child's needs. So he's a young person he's got ADHD, and he's got various other areas of need, and she feels that those needs would not be met if he was to be placed in a large comprehensive school. So in my role as an expert witness, I'm coming in very much to try and understand this young person's holistic needs, and to understand to what extent the 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 mainstream school could put in place interventions and strategies to meet those needs. So part of it's part of the work I'm doing at the moment is having conversations with the mother's preferred school, right? But
Mhm.
also having conversations with the school which the local authority has identified, and trying to elicit the strategies and interventions which would be in place to meet this young person's needs. And I think the issue for a lot of local authorities, has to be, one of around resources, right? They've got, resources are dwindling. They've got finite budgets. So a lot of the time, when parents are coming and saying, "Look, we want school X," the local authority will be weighing that up and thinking, well, actually, we would rather your child went to one of our schools, because going to school X is going to be that much more expensive. So you're constantly having to navigate that. And having been a senior leader, a head of service within local authorities, I totally understand some of those challenges, right? That there is always a need to ensure that whatever the size of the cake, so to speak, it's important that that's shared equally, amongst the young people, within your local authority. But at the same time, I think there is something about ensuring that we fully appreciate and identify the needs of individuals. So that if a child or a young person has got specific needs which cannot be met within a mainstream setting, it's so important that local authorities um, identify that and accept that, and that they make other provisions. Whereas I think what I often find is that a lot of parents are forced down the road of tribunals and having to advocate and challenge local authority decisions, which are usually overturned at tribunal stage anyway, because a lot of them don't really make sense, right? So I think there's something about ensuring that where the parents' claims are really clear, my view is that local authorities should be agreeing to some of those requests rather than putting parents through loopholes of having to go to sentence tribunals and so forth. So, coming back to my role, it's very much about trying to understand what the child or young person's needs are, trying to build that picture of the education environment, what that might look like, thinking about the education, health and care plan, if there's one in place, or if there isn't, ensuring that we get one in place to fully meet the child's needs, and then looking at the interventions and provision which are required to meet those needs. But finally, I suppose, as an expert witness, around sendist appeals, my role is very much about constantly challenging local authorities where I feel that they're not putting the needs of the child at the center, and also constantly challenging local authorities where I feel that they're behaving in a discriminatory way. So I suppose one of the things I sometimes find is that some children will be given the label of having social, emotional, and mental health needs, whereas other children will be given the label of having ADHD needs and so forth. So they sometimes when we talk about discriminatory practice, it is about the lenses through which we view children and young people's behaviors, and that sometimes we fail to see some children as having specific learning difficulties if they're Black, but we have more of a tendency of seeing specific learning difficulties for children who are white, right? Or we are more likely to see behavioral difficulties in Black boys, whereas we are less likely to see that as an issue for white children and would label that as ADHD or whatever. And I think that there's something about understanding the labels that can be used for different children according to their different ethnicities and their color, and that often those labels get in the way, become barriers to meeting those children's needs. And I also think, we often talk about issues around adultification. I think that often the behaviors of some can be viewed through lenses where it's seen as more grown up and more mature and less deserving of care and empathy.
How does psychology play a role in assessing special education needs and disabilities? And what are some of the specific psychological factors that are assessed when evaluating SEND cases?
Yeah, the role that psychology plays is very much around, when we think about the focus, when I was talking about some schools where they say, well, actually, the role of the psychologist is just to focus on the SEND areas. By that, they're saying that actually the psychologist should come in and just consider issues of around cognition and learning, i.e., how is this child functioning in terms of their cognitive development, their memory, their processing ability to process information and language, and really and also focusing around kind of mental health issues and what their needs are there. And so those are kind of the different areas in terms of psychology. But I suppose for me, I feel that psychology is much more about looking at that holistic child, and that the focus is about understanding the systems and the behaviors, the behaviors of the people within the systems around the child. So that's about understanding the family, understanding the school, understanding, the peer group, you know, and that, when you apply psychology to understanding how those different systems are functioning and um, how they're either getting in the way of the child's outcomes or how they're supporting the outcomes, you're able to think about the behavior. When you're doing that, you're looking at the behaviors of the individuals within those systems. So psychology, because psychology essentially is about understanding behavior and understanding about, kind of how, how our thinking and feelings and everything else, how that they impact on our behavior. So, and within kind of understanding behavior, it's also about understanding learning and kind of how we support learning and ensure that children and young people are fulfilling their outcomes. So, so the role of the psychologist is really about pulling all of that together and trying to provide that picture of what needs to be put in place to support the child to achieve their outcomes and to overcome some of the barriers which may be in place.
Can you discuss the importance of the advocacy for individuals with disabilities within the context of these cases?
Yes, no, absolutely. I think we covered some of this earlier, didn't we? So I think they when whether we're talking about allyship or whether we're talking about advocates, I think it's really important that children and young people have people who can advocate for them, right? And I suppose what often saddens me when I think about some of the cases I work with is that some parents are less aware of their rights and their entitlements, right? And that you hear people talking about postcode lotteries and how if you're in one postcode you're more likely to get that, and if you're and so forth. And I suppose what I find is that it's very difficult for parents to navigate all of that, and that a lot of parents don't know what their children are entitled to. They don't know how to approach the schools and actually say, well, my child is only getting the support, but this child over here is getting much more, and and my child has got an education, health, and care plan, but there's no support being provided, or whatever, right? There's or my child needs an education plan, but you're saying that I've got to wait 3 terms before applying for one. There's something about parents. Some parents are not haven't got the language or haven't got the know-how of how to navigate these tricky systems. So as a result, the child or the young person ends up getting a raw deal in terms of what they're receiving. So I think in those situations, it's so important that parents have advisors or advocates or someone they can turn to who can support them in navigating those conversations and some of those situations. Because otherwise, I find that only the parents who speak loudest, or only the parents who can afford solicitors for tribunals and whatever, will challenge the system, and often they end up getting what they need for their child, but the parents who are not able to challenge and articulate what's going wrong, their children don't always receive what they should.
And that's a really harsh reality. And it's so unfair. And it's it's absolutely shocking. In your experience, what are some common misconceptions about these cases, and how do you address them?
Well, I suppose, with a local authority hat on, when I was a senior leader within local authority, you'd always kind of think, yeah, we try and do the best for all children, right? I mean, that's the standard line. We try and do the best for all children. We think that, Johnny's needs can be met in the school, and therefore that's why we're recommending it. But I think sometimes when you shine a torchlight on the decision making processes and on the evidence, you find that that's not the case, right? You find that some children are being failed by local authorities because of inequities within the system. And I always remember I had one a special needs manager who I worked with many years ago, who would say to me, when tribunals, when parents took out tribunals, and in some cases, it was really clear cut that the parent had a case, but his view was, oh, we'll wait until the day of the tribunal before conceding. So it was always like, irregardless of whether the parent has a case or not, you push it to tribunal because he knew that parents who haven't got the confidence and parents who haven't got the money will essentially fall out of the system. They will give up before the day of the tribunal. Which is, it's that kind of that inequity within the system which continues to fail pupils, especially when you're talking about children from disadvantaged backgrounds, where parents are not able to advocate for their children in the same way that, say, for example, white middle class parents can. You find that those children end up, unfortunately, getting a raw deal. That's not in every case, right? But it's to say that, I come across a lot of these cases where that is happening, and families where, because they can't afford either to pay for my services, they're then kind of, I'm then kind of left in a position where I'm either looking at offering pro bono work, but I can't do that for every case, but it does become a case of those parents who can afford to challenge local authorities at tribunals, and those parents who can speak the loudest are often the parents who will get better provision for their children.
What strategies do you employ to effectively communicate the complex psychological findings to legal professionals and decision makers in these tribunals?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the cases, we have legal, if you're working on a case, I'll be the psychology expert. There'll be other experts. So you'll have occupational therapy expert witnesses. You'll have, speech and language therapy expert witnesses. All working to that same case, right? So basically, say for example, I'm acting. I've been instructed as an expert witness for the child as the claimant, right? So I would be working with a team of other expert witnesses, who are writing those those reports, and as part of that we have legal conferences where we really kind of look at pulling together some of the evidence that may be there and exploring some of those questions and so forth. And within those meetings, I often find myself having to break down, you have to break down your assessment and educate the barrister or the solicitor in understanding the psychological formulation that you've reached and that you've used in your assessment. And I always remember one barrister saying to me, he had read my report and he said, I must admit, this is the first report I've read, and I totally feel I understand the role of the psychologist and the needs of this child. And it was really kind of, he was saying he had read so many psychological reports, but he hadn't fully kind of appreciated the kind of the triangulation of information and how that is done, and the kind of the psychological formulation. So it was really great to get that feedback and to kind of get a sense of when you're working as a psychology expert witness, you are there to educate other experts as well as support the barrister, the solicitor, and the judge in understanding what the child's needs are, and in understanding any barriers to learning or barriers to inclusion that may be there.
Hmm. How do you ensure that the assessments and testimony accurately reflects the needs and experiences of individuals?
Yeah, I would say through evidence gathering, right? Gathering, um, carrying out assessments, um, and ensuring that you gather evidence from the different parts of the system, from schools, from home, from the community, and so forth, and then triangulating and pulling that evidence together to get a full picture of what that child's needs are. So, gathering evidence is key, but also using my expertise as a psychologist in psychological formulation and, asking the questions which need to be asked about how that child or young person is functioning within the system and what support is required to help them meet their outcomes. So, it's very much a combination of both kind of the evidence gathering, but also the psychological formulation. And then, key to that is then the kind of the recommendations you make at the end of that to point people in the right direction in terms of what needs to happen for that child or the young person.
Um, like, sorry. Can you share any specific examples or case studies where expert testimony played a crucial role in advocating for appropriate accommodations and support for individuals with special educational needs and disabilities?
Yes, I mean there plenty, there plenty. I mean I'm thinking of I'm trying to think which one I'm going to use. Um, yeah, I mean, I had one case recently where a child was out of school. No, it was a 14-year-old who had an ASD diagnosis and ADHD, and basically he was refusing to attend school. And the local authority had basically got the stage where they'd been saying to the mother, "Your child needs to be in school. Your child needs to be in school," and the parent was failing in the local authority's eyes. The parent was failing to get their child into school daily, or at all. And so the local authority felt that their hand was forced, and they felt that they needed to bring legal proceedings, towards the mother, and to take the mother to court for failure to get the child into school. And so I was brought in by the solicitors to look at the child's needs and to explore what some of the issues were and to make recommendations about this particular young person. And it was really clear, when I was doing, I started off by meeting with the parent to, to kind of to hear her views and to understand her story. I then met with a young person and I did some assessments to get a sense of what his needs were. Um, and really what was coming through was very much kind of the the immense anxiety which was associated with his conditions, with his with him being autistic, and that he was finding school extremely overwhelming, and because there when there were not enough modifications and interventions in place to meet his needs, he was finding it hard to get into school because of those reasons, because basically the school was just such an overwhelming environment, and he didn't feel supported, and his anxiety was such that he was he was basically screaming the house down and refusing to go into school. So when you look at it like that, and then you kind of think, okay, so to what extent, what hope does this mother have of actually getting him to school? What is she supposed to do? There's no way she can lift him up and put him in the car because he's a 14-year-old who's probably about 5'7", and it's just like, how is she going to, what is she supposed to do? And what was really clear by, in terms of when I was reading this young person's file and, the information I'd got from the solicitors, is that there'd been key failures in terms of the local authority, in terms of identifying this young person's needs in a timely fashion, and in terms of putting in place the interventions and strategies which were required. And so, and so in my conclusion, when I was writing my report up, I pointed to those key failures and made it very clear that, in my professional opinion, I actually felt that it should be the local authority who should be being taken to task for failing to identify needs and to meet this young person's needs, and not the mother. The mother was powerless to do anything about the presenting problem because it had been allowed to accumulate for such a long time. This young person was not getting the support that they required, within the school. The young person was not getting the support that they required for their mental health needs. The CAMS list, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services list, as we know, in different authorities, in different community, in local authorities, was about 2 years long. He was on the waiting list. So there was a failure to actually identify this young person's needs in a timely fashion, and a failure to put the support that was required. So to then be turning to the parent and saying, it's your duty to get him into school no matter what, and if you don't do so, we will take you to court. It seems, totally misguided and totally wrong. And so in my role as an expert, I was able to point to those failings and to say that actually this mother needs help, right? Unless we address some of these key issues, unless we put this support in place, not only does the mother need help for what she's been experiencing all these years, but also the young person needs the appropriate, professional support to help him if he's ever going to return to education. The modifications need to be in place, and there needs to be consideration given to their school environment going forward.
Hmm. What advice would you give to parents or caregivers, or let me rephrase that. What advice would you give to primary caregivers who are navigating the social education needs and disabilities process for their children?
Yeah, I think I suppose the key advice is about, try and identify where you can get support from, right? There are lots of charities around who offer support for children and young people who've got special educational needs. Those charities will offer funding support in terms of getting assessments done. So, for example, the Quorum Legal Centre
Mm.
are one whereby, depending on, it's means tested, depending on, kind of, how much you earn, they can offer support in terms of ensuring that for children who, I think they have to be at the education health, there has to be an education health and care plan in place, but they can offer support in challenging local authority decisions and in ensuring that the child or the young person gets the support they require. There are other charities who will offer support in, again, getting those assessments carried out. They'll offer advocacy support for parents. And so I suppose my key advice would be, you're not alone, right? Reach out, reach out and identify the support that you need, and speak to other parents because often, some other parents will have experienced similar difficulties, right? So it's about actually, ensuring that you build a network of parents who can support you, but also reaching out to these other charities who can also help. I think I would be saying that if you're able to navigate the system and read up on, on the special education needs code of practice and so forth, it's important to because a lot of these documents have got parent-friendly versions, right? So reading up on some of the information which is around about how to meet children's needs within the school system and so forth, it's so important to try and do that so that you really kind of educate yourself about your rights and entitlement as a parent so that you're better able to advocate for your child when you need to.
How do you approach cases when there may be conflicting opinions among experts regarding the assessment and support needs of individuals?
Yeah, I mean you get that. I mean it's definitely with all the kind of the legal cases. You'll have those who are acting for the claimant, those who are acting for the defendant. So the ones who are acting for the claimant are the ones where they're acting for the parent and the young person, and the defendant they're usually acting for the hospital trust, yeah, the health trust, or for the school or whatever, right? And so within that, so I could be the psychologist who's working as a claimant psychologist, and then there'll be another psychologist who's working for the defendant. So basically, part of the task of these legal claims is about, I need to comment on the report from the defendant psychologist, and they need to do the same. And we often come together to um, to really kind of look at joint expert witness statements, which kind of help the judge navigate and fully understand, what the psychology professionals are saying about those needs. So there will always be differences of opinion, but I suppose what I'm saying is that the process of these legal cases, built into the process of these legal cases, is their opportunity to be able to iron some of those differences out as far as possible, and to look at kind of doing so in, ideally with a view to, those cases then not needing to go to trial. So if we can iron some of those issues out and an agreement can be reached, then actually, 80% of the cases will not actually reach trial or tribunal, because they'll have been resolved and settled beforehand.
Are there any systematic issues within the education system that you believe contribute to challenges faced by individuals with special educational needs and disabilities? And if so, how do you address them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the systematic challenges are very much in line with some of the things I've mentioned already. I think, um, there. I mean, there's a whole list of challenges. I think a the key one is the first one is very much about the failure of local authorities and schools to act in a timely fashion, to identify needs early on before the problems build up, right? So
Mm.
I think if children's needs were identified early, then it gives us a chance to put in place the strategies and support required. But often I find that, so a lot of the cases I must get involved in, you look back in terms of the case history, and you actually find yourself asking the question, well, why is it that this child's needs were not assessed when he was in year three? It was clear that he had needs, but often, because as we know, there's a shortage of education psychologists. The local authorities have got dwindling budgets. Often what happens is that assessments which should be taking place, and the interventions which should be being put in place, are not occurring, and they then serve as barriers to actually identifying the child's needs. So yeah, so I mean, I think kind of timely assessments, making sure that the provision is put in place. There are lots of young people and lots of children, who've got speech and language therapy needs, which frankly, I was working for one local authority where, I had a young person, a child who was, I think it was something like 5 years old. He was not able to speak, and yet they were arguing that he doesn't need speech and language therapy. And it was just like, oh yeah, well, the criteria is, he doesn't meet the threshold. What do you mean he doesn't meet the threshold? It's like, this is a young person who, when I assessed him, non-verbally, very bright, very able, but he wasn't speaking. So there is something about, whilst I understand some of the challenges local authorities face in terms of budgets, I do feel that some of the decisions which are made, act in a detrimental fashion for some of the children pupils they're serving, and by delaying those assessments, it means those problems become more acute, so that by the time the child gets to secondary school, they're either refusing to go to school, or they're acting out, or whatever, and then by the time they leave school, they're either on the youth offending register or whatever. So there's something about, when you look at how systematic failures pile on for some of these children, and that's not for all of them, but for some of those children, the failure to identify their needs in a timely fashion and to put in place the provision and interventions required and strategies. That failure, when that child or when that young person gets to the age of 18 and makes a decision which people can't comprehend, or something goes wrong, or whatever, you can trace that back to some of those earlier failures.
Mm.
So, I just kind of feel that, with some of these children, we let them down by failing to adequately identify and address their special needs early on when they're young enough, and that often some of those difficulties or challenges then become more acute as they get older.
Can you discuss any specific legislation or policy change that have impacted the rights and support services available to individuals with additional needs or disabilities or disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, there've been a lot of kind of government policy guidance, right? And I think, and I do think even, things like, documents like this, the code of practice and so forth, they focus on what needs to be done in identifying needs and in putting in place, that support. I think there's certainly a lot of policy at the moment and guidance around, children who are and not refusing to come into school, right? And thinking about how local authorities can work with parents and so forth. And there's a lot of guidance around, meeting the needs of children with mental health problems and so forth. But guidance, I think it goes back to that conversation we had about policies and guidance. They're only as useful and as good as kind of how they're kind of that they're enforced and how they're interpreted and put into place. And so often I feel that there's because of the failings I've already discussed around kind of the lack of assessments, the lack of resources and so forth, it actually means that some of those recommendations and some of those strategies are not being followed through.
Looking ahead, what advancements or changes do you anticipate in the field of psychology as it pertains to SEND cases?
Good question. Um, there's been a lot of talk about the reform of the education system, right? And certainly on various platforms where I'm, as a psychologist, and I'm discussing with other psychologists, there've been discussions about psychologists having a seat at the table when those discussions around reforming the education system actually take place. And I suppose one of the things I said, when we were, when I was having this conversation, email conversation with some of my peers, education psychologists, is that for psychologists to have a seat at the table in reviewing the education system and commenting on what needs to be in place, I feel that as psychologists we need to broaden our understanding and we need to broaden our understanding of some of the challenges which face young people, children and young people and parents. And by that, I feel that educational psychologists, as you know, generally is a very white profession.
Mm.
It's and when you look at the foundations, kind of when you look back to when education psychologists first began, it's a very white profession. It's very there are very few. There are not as many, black and ethnic minorities. When you look at kind of the senior leadership, so principal education psychologists, I remember about 4 years ago going to a principal education psychologist meeting because I was a PEP myself. It was probably about 6 years ago. And walking into the room, and I was the only black person within the room, and there were about 40, principal education psychologists, all white. So there's something about how the profession currently, in terms of representation, meets and addresses the needs of people who are different. But within that, I also feel that there's more work that the profession of psychologists, educational psychologists, and I'm just saying educational, but I think the same, applies to clinical psychologists and other areas. I think there's a need to really kind of to bring our understanding of some of the various issues around discrimination, around the holistic needs and cultural needs of children and young people, and to really kind of explore how we meet the standards which have been laid out by the healthcare professionals council. Because I read to you what those standards were, right, in terms of the duty which education psychologists have got in addressing discrimination, disadvantage, and so forth. And I suppose one of my main challenges is that currently we have those duties which have been spelled out, but there's very little that I'm aware of that's being done to actually measure how psychologists are meeting those standards. So what I would quite like to see is a broader curriculum in terms of the training of psychologists, which includes much more information around understanding and dealing with discriminations, challenging and dealing with racism, has toolkits like the 6 stages framework, so that when psychologists are being trained, there's a lot more focus being given to how psychologists can challenge discrimination when they see it, and what their role is in terms of collating evidence to do so. So and I do think that actually, if psychologists are better able to do that, it then means that we're able to better meet and address the needs of the changing global population and the needs of the global majority, right? Because currently I feel that because of the roots of education psychology and the makeup of education psychology services, I feel that actually we're not as able to empathize and understand the needs of those who are different, and that leads to a problem in terms of actually how we retain black and ethnic minority staff within education psychology teams, because often what you find is that you'll find education psychologists going and being trained, but they'll only last within the local authority for 2 years before they're pushed out because of some form of discrimination or something that occurs. So there's an issue around kind of lack of retention, but there's also an issue around ensuring that educating psychologists in their understanding of what discrimination is, what discrimination looks like, and the role that educational psychologists have in challenging that. And then finally, I think that there's also a need to look at measuring the progress that individual psychologists are making in adhering to their HCP standards. So how do we know, for example, if you have a psychologist going into one of your schools, how do we know that that psychologist is actually fulfilling some of those standards? How do you measure that? And that's where I feel that the six stages framework as a supervisory and performance management tool it's really essential, because there's something about being able to take baseline measures as to what stage are these different psychologists at in terms of their understanding and ability to deal with discrimination, and then monitoring how they're doing on a year in year out basis, so that EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, that becomes part of the performance management
Mm.
system, which looks at the way in which psychologists and individual psychology professionals are able to adhere to the standards that have been laid out by the Healthcare Professionals Council.
Mm. Reflecting on our discussion today, what are the key takeaways or messages that you hope our listeners will remember?
I I think oh my goodness, where do I begin? I think some of the key takeaways are around understanding the complexities of some of the systems your children and may be in, right? So kind of understanding that there used to be a game called The Maze in the 80s, I think, which talked about the experience of parents navigating the special educational needs system. Understanding that the system is still a maze and that it can be incredibly difficult for parents, right?
Mm.
So some of the key takeaways are around kind of getting the support you need, reaching out. I offer an hour free consultation where I support parents to think about their children's needs and to help them. I point them in the right direction of what they need to do. Um, so I think, when we're thinking about parents, then it's about kind of how they navigate that system, and how they, and I suppose another key takeaway is about understanding the requirements for individual professionals like psychologists in their duty towards calling out and challenging discrimination when they see it. So that if, as a parent, if you are, either Black, Asian, a parent, and your child, and you feel that your child is being treated differently, and that the school are not listening, when you have that conversation with your educational psychologist for the first time, raise those as issues. And if the education psychologist does not support you in exploring that in more detail, then actually they're not abiding by their duties in terms of actually, looking at diversity and inclusion. So I think there's something about parents, as parents, knowing what your rights and entitlements are, but also knowing what the duty and the expectations are on individual professionals who are working with your children. Um, and then I think the other thing is about really kind of recognizing the journey that organizations go through. So, using, being aware of toolkits like the six stages framework, which help organizations to think about the progress they're making in terms of dealing with issues of discrimination. Um, and then finally, I think there's something about um, looking at the whole theme of breaking barriers, right? Looking at the need to break barriers across the lifeline of a child or young person, right? So there's something about that failure to meet and identify needs in a timely fashion. There's that as those children get older, that sometimes when we fail them in that way, they can then end up um kind of within kind of youth offending teams and whatever else. So there's something about ensuring that we're looking at the consequences of not addressing and meeting needs in a timely fashion. And we are constantly asking that question: how do we remove barriers, and how do we you know what does the outcome, what does the future look like right, for this young person? Yes, I've said they don't need the support, but where will they be in 10 years' time? What does the future look like? What will they be doing? And how will my decision impact on their outcomes in the future?
How do you see the intersection of psychology and advocacy continue to evolve in the future, particularly in the areas we explore today?
I think it's to me it's a slow evolution. I mean, I think that there's some psychologists, for example, who believe that we're not there to advocate for parents. And to a certain extent, if you're a local authority psychologist, it's very difficult to walk that tightrope of independence and putting the child at the center, and then on the other side, local authority budgets and dwindling resources. Because I know, for example, when I work for local authorities, because I often try and keep my hand in just to get a sense of what local authorities are doing. So if I'm working as a local psychologist, for example, I know that the way I write my report as an expert witness, and the way I openly challenge some of the schools and some of the local authorities, if I was to write that report in the same way as a locum psychologist, the senior psychologist would send it back because they'd be saying, well, actually, this doesn't look good on the local authority, and we need to, we can't be saying that the child needs speech and language therapy. We can't be saying that the child needs this, right? So there's something about that toning down of what the child's needs are, which sometimes occurs within local authorities, and which educational psychologists, unfortunately, are caught up in. And I sort of feel that until educational psychologists can be allowed to be truly independent in terms of their assessment and recommendations they make, truly independent without worrying about the voice of the local authority and and what the senior psychologist will say, or what the head of service or director of education would say in relation to that report. Until education psychologists can be allowed to be truly independent, it's very difficult to think about how the needs of children can be kept firmly in the center, and how individuals can be supported to advocate for children who are disadvantaged and who need that, and children from the global majority, or children with who are neurodivergent, right? It's very difficult to keep those needs at the center when you're constantly thinking about how do you word and phrase the child's needs so that the local authority doesn't have to pay so much money.
Mm. Are there any upcoming projects or initiatives that you're particularly excited about and would like to share with our audience?
Yeah, there are lots. I've currently got a student working in an American university using the Six Stages framework and doing some research. So she's using the Six Stages framework as a tool to engage in conversations with university students to get a sense of their experiences. So I'll be sharing that with you once that's completed. We've got a conference coming up, and it's going to be an EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion roundtable event in the morning, and a conference in the afternoon around the Six Stages framework. And that's going to be on the 19th of June. And certainly I would love to see parents there, so that you can come and hear more about the Six Stages framework. And we're trying to keep the cost very low, so we're looking at about £30 per ticket, in terms of the costs. And we're hoping to generate funding for the conference through sponsors. So anyone out there who's listening, if you've got money and you can help us, you can help with sponsoring this event, please let me know and get in touch with me. In terms of email contact, you can get hold of me on at Shungu at sixstagesframework.com. So that's Shungu at sixstagesframework.com. And any other events? I'm looking at kind of writing my second book. I've already started that. And what other projects have we got going on? Yeah, lots of different things. But again, some of them I can't quite share yet because we're we haven't quite fully worked out the timeline for them.
What advice would you give to individuals who are interested in pursuing careers or activism related to the topics we discussed today?
The advice is very much about networking, making sure that you're making contact with the relevant people, looking at kind of, educating yourself in terms of what's needed. I talk about the 6 stages framework as a personal development tool, right? For everyone, right? Kind of understanding and dealing with biases and discrimination is something we all need to be doing. So I think, what the advice I'd be giving is very much about, you know, you know, linking, with myself and reaching out and kind of finding out the work that I'm doing and any opportunities there may be to support that work. I've had a number of kind of assistant psychologists and research students working with me who then go on to, because they've had that experience of working with me, they can then apply for other positions. So I think, so the advice is very much about networking, identifying, like-minded people who you can do research with and become an agent for change. And I do feel that, being an agent for change includes ensuring that we are doing research within the area and we have the evidence base to talk about some of the challenges that we're seeing and how they're being addressed.
In your opinion, what role do educational institutions, governments, and society as a whole play in addressing the issues we have covered?
Oh, they've got a massive role. I think they they play a pivotal role, but but I suppose the question is, to what extent are they managing to meet that role, and to what extent are they actually doing so? So I suppose I was disappointed when the commission, I think it was the government's Commission on Race Equality, brought out a report about 3 years ago where they sort of said, where they were talking about, does racism exist or not? And they were saying, well, actually, racism doesn't really exist. It's all about victim narratives and mentalities and whatever else. I think there's some work which needs to be done with the government, right? And with the royal family, where, really kind of exploring their understanding and ability to deal with discrimination and racism. So I think that whole piece about we all need to be doing the work. I really believe that some of the institutions, the ones you've mentioned, like the government and so forth, the people who are leading the government are not necessarily doing the work. And I feel that, in a sense, until you get all levels of society exploring their biases and thinking about how biases impact, and thinking about this, how discrimination impacts at an individual level for children and young people in schools, but also for employees, and until you're doing all that work at those different stages, and that work needs to include not only teachers and head teachers, but boards, right? So, and that work needs to include the government, and that work needs to include people at the top. Unless that's happening, then the progress we make in addressing discrimination and discriminatory behaviors and in ensuring equity and inclusion, becomes weakened, because the people at the top are not fully understanding what the challenges are, and are not fully understanding what the impact is on individuals, and they're not understanding those lived experiences. So, for example, recently, again, I talked a little bit about, the whole discussion about whether the comments Lee Anderson, who's an MP, had made were Islamophobic. I think, when you look at the reluctance there was for certain senior conservative leaders, including the Prime Minister, and including, and I watched an interview this morning where a senior leader of the Conservative Party was being asked, well, were those comments, yes, it was an LBC interview. He was being asked, were those comments Islamophobic? And he said, well, I think the comments were wrong. And the interviewer, pushed him and said, well, but were they Islamophobic? And I think the the comments were wrong. That inability to actually kind of call out discrimination and and call it out for what it is, right? Unless senior leaders and unless the government and others are able to do that, it actually stops us from making the progress that we have to make in challenging discrimination and racism, and in ensuring the progress that we need to make in kind of fostering inclusion and belonging.
What do you see as the biggest challenges or obstacles to progress in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Exactly that. I think my response to that, my last response, are the biggest challenges, right? The need for people who are at the top in, whether it be in government, in government organizations, in the government, in the royal family, whether it be at board levels, you need, the work around biases and discrimination is not just for frontline workers, it's for everyone. That work needs to be happening at all those different levels. And I also feel that the work around challenging biases and understanding biases and dealing with them and being an ally and so forth, that work needs to be happening at training courses. So teacher training courses, the training of police officers, they should be happening at the training of psychologists and so forth. And unless that work is happening in a rigorous and really clear way, then we will fail to make the progress that we need in ensuring that everyone within society has a voice and feels like the work environment is one which is welcoming and one where they fully belong, and that children within the school system feel that their voices can be heard, and that that they're not fearful of the disparities in treatment or which can occur because of the color of their skin, or because of their of their of their of their condition, where they when we're talking about neurodiversity.
Is there anything you'd like to add or share with our listeners before we wrap up?
No, no, just say, I mean, feel free to reach out, drop me an email. I'm always happy to have conversations. I sort of believe that this kind of work, it's not the kind of thing you just kind of tick a box and, and I'm sure, you're not going to do that, right? I think we've done a podcast on this, right? It's important to return back to these conversations. So I talk, when I do my training around the 6 stages framework, I usually provide people with a reflective journal, so that they are using that journal before the training, during the training, but way after the training, so that you're reviewing and thinking about the issues, all the and so forth. So you're not seeing it as, oh well, I've done my diversity, equity, and inclusion training for the year. That's me, it's done and dusted, and we don't have to worry anymore about it, which is what some organizations tend to see, right? So I suppose what I'd be saying is, you reach out, let's have a conversation. If you're able to assist in any way with the work I'm doing, I'd love to hear from you. And I'm always looking for people to collaborate with. And yeah, and on my website, Inclusion Psychologists Limited. So that's www.inclusionpsychologists.com. You'll find a list of kind of the different services I provide, including some of the therapies and assessment services that I provide as well.
Finally, what's one thing that you're grateful for today?
Oh my goodness, now that's a really good question. Um, Yeah, I mean, I think a major thing I'm probably really grateful for today and have been all week is the support I'm getting, because I've got a problem with my knee, so I've had a lot of kind of mobility. I've got arthritis. I've got mobility issues, and and one of the things I recognize as some of those challenges become more acute It's just how difficult it is to move around and navigate some of the, I'm able to experience disability firsthand, right? And kind of what that means in terms of what I'm able to. So yeah, so I've recently got my grant from Access to Work, and I'm able to get support for that. So I'm really grateful to the government and to Access to Work for having that grant available for people who need it. I think that, but the only thing I'd say is, but the more I mention it to people, the more I'm recognizing that not enough people know about it. So there's
Mm.
something about how do we ensure that we're providing support, to break barriers and to support people, who need that support, whatever that may be, because the Access to Work grant is for people with disabilities, but people who are neurodivergent and so forth. But not necessarily, but you don't have to have a diagnosis. But how do we ensure that the people who need that support in their work are aware of those grants and the support which is available? But yeah, I'm immensely grateful to be able to have that support, because it allows me to continue to do my work in a way that I wouldn't be able to do otherwise.
Thank you so much for coming on to our podcast. It, your insights are absolutely profound and invaluable, and your unwavering commitment to dismantling the barriers, combating discrimination, and championing justice is nothing short of inspiring. It's
Thank you. Thank you.
amazing. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
It's okay. As we draw to the end of today's episode, I accept my deepest gratitude to our esteemed guest, Dr. Shungu H, for gracing us with her profound expertise and invaluable insights. I trust that our dialogue has illuminated pressing societal issues and ignited meaningful contemplation and discourse among our audience. Let us remember that each of us possesses the capacity to effect positive change within our community and beyond. If today's episode has resonated with you and sparked reflection, I encourage you to share it with your loved ones, colleagues, and friends. And to be sure to subscribe to My Drum's Chronic, but I'm Iconic, to stay abreast of forthcoming episodes. Thank you for joining us. Stay iconic until next time.